everybody. Thanks for coming. You have to bear with me. I'm fighting a sinus infection, so got 5 bottles of water, got my cough drops. Hopefully we'll be good. So today we're going to be talking about the JavaScript framework cage match. And so these are all the different frameworks that we're going to be talking about: Next, Redwood, SvelteKit, Astro, and Remix. Just by a show of hands, how many people have used Next? Awesome. Redwood? Yes. Thank you, Dustin. SvelteKit? Okay, just a few. Astro? Remix? Okay. And I think you're my friend that likes to try all of them, just like myself. And then I know this is on the Vue track, so is everybody else Vue people? Vue? Oh, just a few. Okay. Awesome. So these are all the frameworks, and I primarily stuck with React. So what I did was I built the same application on all these different frameworks. And I know SvelteKit is here. That's not really React. And I didn't do anything with Vue, so I can't give it a fair comparison. My knowledge isn't what it should be when it comes to that. But I think what I've learned in the process of this is when I'm really trying to learn a framework and learn what it's capable of, the best way that I can do that is by actually building something. It's not just reading a tutorial or watching a YouTube video. When you're working on a real project, you encounter different problems that you would have if you were just doing tutorials. So Next is a great Vue framework. Like I said, I don't have enough background with that to be able to speak to it. So these are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. And I kind of was talking about learning how to work with these different frameworks and learning through projects. Probably reached that realization through a project that I built on Tailwind. So if you look at the documentation on Tailwind, they specifically say that I know what you're thinking. Tailwind styles are an atrocity or a horrible mess. And you're right, it is ugly until you actually try it. And that's what it says on the end. And so that's how I feel about frameworks. Not that they're an atrocity, but you actually have to try them to see how you feel about them. So I took that same methodology and built the same site out 6 different ways. If you're interested, you can go to this landing page. There's a QR code at the bottom. That'll give you access to all my slides. And you can get code examples and resources and things like that. I see a few phones, so I'll wait for you guys to get the link. Awesome. And feel free to message me after the talk if you have any additional questions. And so my name is Amy Dutton. I'm a lead maintainer on the Redwood JS core team. So I did mention these are the frameworks. Redwood I do have a lot of experience with just because that is my day job, and that's what I do full time. Now at Redwood, we do kind of consider ourselves as the underdog. So when I was at ReactConf in April, I was surprised by how many people had never even heard of Redwood. So I'll give a few more details about that until we get into the nitty-gritty and start looking at code samples. So my first introduction to Redwood was through my podcast. So shameless self-plug. It's called Compressed.FM. It is all about web design and development with a little bit of zest. My co-host is James Q. Quick. He has a very successful YouTube channel, but he knew David Price, who is one of the co-founders of Redwood, and asked him to come on the show. So that's episode 54, if you're interested in listening to it. And as a quick side note, you'll notice that there are several QR codes throughout just to get you to the resources if you're interested in looking at them. But David basically pitched me Redwood, and he pointed me to the documentation. There's a tutorial there within the documentation, and it's really just a masterclass in how to build a full stack application and really tells you everything that you need to know in order to build an app. So Redwood's been around for 5 years. It was co-founded by a guy named Tom Preston Warner, and he also co-founded a little project. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. Well, it's GitHub. But if you've used the extension TOML, he is also the Tom in TOML. So he sold GitHub to Microsoft, and he's created his own venture capital company called Preston Warner Ventures. So Redwood is completely independent, it's open source, and it's sponsored by Preston Warner Ventures. We also had Tom on the podcast, episode 143, if you want to listen to that. So startups that have built their company on Redwood and received funding have raised over $100 million in funding. So even though we might consider it the underdog, it's quite successful. And probably the most successful startup is Puzzmo. And this was founded or co-founded by Orta Thoreau. He used to work on the Microsoft TypeScript team, and then he left there to go build Puzzmo, and he's already sold it. It's been acquired by Hearst Publications. So since they launched a year ago, they've had over 9 million games played. And this stat's probably old because this was from April, so it's much higher now. But Redwood is a very successful project, and we've had very successful companies build their stuff on top of Redwood. Now, I don't want this to be a commercial for Redwood. That would be a disservice to calling this a cage match and then basically weighting everything towards Redwood. But I just wanted to give you a little bit more background since it's probably one of the lesser known. I think only Dutton was the one that was familiar with Redwood or had built on it. So when you look at all of these, I really do believe that the rising tide lifts all boats. And I think we have something to learn from everyone. As someone that works on frameworks full time, I love looking at the decisions that other frameworks have made to see how they've solved the same problems that we're dealing with and how they've chosen to structure their projects and how they've approached those things differently. As I was working on this, I do want to give a shout out to Century because they've been a partner in this whole process and helped provided tools and metrics just to help keep everything objective. So if you're interested in looking at these projects, everything is open source on my GitHub account. Now, my 5th grade English teacher taught me that when you want to write a paper or talk about something, first you tell someone what you're going to do, then you show them how to do it, and then you do it. So you're kind of establishing a roadmap. So I want to give you that roadmap of what we're going to do. And I live in Nashville, that's if you're wondering why that's the starting point. So what I built, and we'll talk about that, application. We'll talk about what makes a framework. There's, hint, 5 different things that I think make a framework. Why would you even use a framework? And which framework should you use? Let me do a little BuzzFeed, it's not what you think. So the first thing, what I actually built. So I built this app called Brazilian Nut News, and it's essentially a Hacker News clone. And it's called Brazilian Nut News because in a jar of assorted nuts, Brazilian nuts always rise to the top. And that's basically what Hacker News is, right? You want the best news to rise to the top. And you use a voting system to make sure that that happens. So that's where the name came from. So just to describe the features as I'm putting these things through the test, there's a commenting system, and there's also threaded comments where you can vote on those comments. There's a profile page for each user where you can see links that they've shared, comments, their favorite links. You have edit your own profile. There's a login page. So there's authentication and authorization. And then I also have some statically generated legal pages. So there's a little bit of everything there. When you look at the database, there's a bunch of different types of relationships. So you have many-to-many, you have many-to-one, and one-to-one relationships. So really trying to do as much as I can to test these frameworks and explore these problems. So like I said, with the tech stack, I really tried to standardize it as much as possible just to make these comparisons fair and equal. And the nice part about this is because it is React, a lot of the code is reusable. So I was able to build the front end once and then reuse a lot of that code. So the tech stack, this is one of the things that people really love about JavaScript, right, is the composability, for you to be able to pick the best tools that you like the most and to be able to bring those to the table, and to be able to pick those tools. So let's look at each piece really quickly in case there are some logos there that you're not familiar with. And I also just want to continue to underline the point that even though I'm using 6 different frameworks, for the most part, I'm still using the same underlying technology and services. So the first one here is Tailwind. I use this for the styling. I use Supabase. Now what's interesting about Supabase, actually show of hands, how many people have used Supabase before? Oh, not as many as I thought. So the nice thing about Supabase is it's actually a service that uses Postgres under the hood. So you can just use it as a Postgres database, You can use an API for it. On this particular project, I also use Prisma for the API layer. But it will also provide auth, and it also has storage options if you don't want to use something like S3. There's also resend for email. And as a quick side note, I interviewed Zeno, who is one of the co-founders of Resend, on the podcast. So that was a really fun episode. And then, as I mentioned, Prisma. So Prisma, you can use that to build and structure your database. So if we take a quick look at this file, when you install Prisma, you get a schema.prisma file, and that shows you, that allows you to define all of your models. It's like your database tables. And then you'll notice in this file on the right, I've listed all the different content that I need within my database. And then you can run a single command, npx prisma migrate dev, and it will generate a migrations folder. So you can see that on the left. And inside, there's a SQL file, and this writes the raw SQL code for you so that you don't have to. You're just managing that schema file. And so then Prisma keeps track of any changes that you make to that schema.prisma file. And this just makes it really easy if you're working with a team, so that, and everybody's making changes to the database, you can just run that migrate function and it will handle all of that for you. I also use TypeScript. So this is almost, I feel like, become a standard. I've really come to appreciate TypeScript because it has autocomplete, and it can find errors in my code and issues within my code faster. I have GraphQL, and this one's a little bit different. This one's a little bit different. I know there's mixed feelings, but I just came from a GraphQL talk, which is fantastic. But this one I only used in Redwood because Redwood supports GraphQL out of the box. All the other ones I just used either the Prisma API or the Supabase API. I use Storybook. So Storybook is great for building components, front-end components in isolation. So you can test those and see what they look like without having to necessarily dump a component that you're not going to use on the page. I also used Vercel to host sites. And regardless of what you think about the Triangle company, nothing gets easier than just creating a new project and putting it to your GitHub repo, and it just takes care of everything. Like that's kind of become the standard when it comes to hosting. So that's what I built. You can see all the underlying technologies. Now we can kind of get into the good stuff and compare all those things. So what actually makes a framework a framework? So as we dive into the examples and try to figure out what separates one from the next, we want to ask this question. And by using React under the hood, they all have that, like I said, the same underlying technology. And coincidentally, Syntax, this is another podcast I'm a huge fan of, they asked the same question in an episode that was released about a month ago. And Scott Talinsky, one of the co-hosts, also tweeted about it. So if you want, you can read through some of the comments in the thread. It's really interesting. I've grabbed a couple of them and sprinkled them throughout the rest of the presentation. But I had fun going through the replies. It's not, some of it's a lot what you would expect and points to a lot of things that I've actually listed here. But I also, there's some other things that kind of surprised me a little bit, things that you might not necessarily think were important or very important. So what makes a framework? Well, first one, we have the router. You have to give people a way to actually get to your data, to get to your page. You have CRUD, so that stands for create, read, update, and delete. And CRUD is probably 90% of building any application. We take a set of data, we want to be able to view it, we want to manipulate it, pivot it, filter it, and then sort it. And we make inferences and decisions based on that data. And I'd argue that this is going to be even more important as we continue to use AI or LLMs, learning language models, because the data is the core of any application. It's that proprietary information that allows us to feed those models. So it's going to be what separates one application from the next is the data that we feed it. So that CRUD is going to become even more important. We have rendering data. So how does that data get rendered and then shown to the end user? Is that on the client or the server? Is that at build time or when the user makes the request? So that's 3. The 4th thing is the DX, the developer experience. How do you feel when you're developing and building on top of the framework? How are you able to work with your teammates? Is it easier or complicated? Does it enable you to move faster or to slow down? And some of those are personal preferences, but it's those personal preferences that allow us to move faster and move more quickly and efficiently. The other thing is longevity. And notice that this really has nothing to do with dev itself. Really, I think this is about trust. So can we trust the framework that we're building on to have our best interests at heart, to be around this time next year, and even really be around this time 10 years from now? Because if you're going to build your entire system on a framework, you want it to be around. You don't want it to just disappear. So now that we've listed out those 5 things, let's walk through those a little bit more in detail. So with the router, there are a couple of different approaches here. And so we're going to look at a lot of code examples to see how each of these frameworks handles this same problem. So, and if you're curious which particular code this is coming from, in the bottom right, I've included the framework. So here, this is Astro. And in Astro, they're using a file-based routing structure. So as soon as you add a file that has that .astro extension, or actually even if it doesn't, you'll see that there's a disclaimers.mdx file. That's a route. So any page that you add becomes a route. So this comments.astro file can then be accessed by /comments. Or if you're creating content dynamically within Astro, you use square brackets within the name to denote that that part is dynamic and can be swapped out. So if we pass in an ID as part of the URL, you can then access that at /link because it's in the link folder. And then here I'm saying Google, so Google would be the ID. It could be a number or a slug, however you want to do that. But it's those square brackets that allow you to use dynamic content. With Remix, they have a nested routing system, but a flattened file system. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have a folder here. This is the sign up folder. And the link for this sign up page is /signup. But you'll notice that the file name includes the name of the layout within the file name. So you have that _auth, and that allows you to group similar layouts together so that it's using the _auth layout. So you'll see _auth before the forgot password, before the login, the logout, reset password, and sign up. And that's all because they have a similar folder name. Now, if you're working with dynamic content, within Remix, you have a $sign, and that $sign specifies a parameter. So this is the same as a dynamic link. In Astro, we had the square brackets. Here in Remix, we have this $sign. So it works the same way. You can also use files and folders within Remix. But if you're using a folder, then you have to have that page be router.tsx or .jsx. And then you'll notice at the bottom I have markdown files. Those actually get read as pages, and you can name those based on the URL that you're trying to access that with. Now, within SvelteKit, they use a folder-based routing structure. So the folder is the name of the route, and then each page inside has that plus page.svelte. So we talked about Remix. They have a router.tsx file, and Svelte is that plus page. And a lot of people don't like that plus in the name, but I will say the nice thing about it from experience is that when you use that plus in front, it means that the page will always be at the top of the file listing. And then if you have any components inside that are specific to that page, they'll be listed below. So for example, this is for a different project, but you can see that I have that plus page.svelte at the top, and then at the bottom, it has all the files that are specific, all the components that are specific to that particular page. In Svelte, there's also a lib directory that you can use for any shared components. And this is used across multiple pages. And some people will just stick all of their project components within that lib directory just in order to be consistent, instead of dividing them out by page. And at least that way you don't have to worry about when you say refactor something and something that you thought was going to be page specific, then you need to use across multiple pages. You got to move that file and then do a little bit of refactoring. So at least if you put everything in your lib directory to begin with, you don't have to worry about that. My personal preference, like either way is fine, just as long as you agree upon something at the beginning of the project. So still within Svelte, you'll also notice that there is a plus layout.svelte file. And this is for handling layouts. Next is similar in its setup, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because Next and Svelte are both funded by Vercel, and so they borrow a lot of ideas from each other. Redwood uses a file-based approach, and this is completely different than anything else that we've looked at. I'm a little partial to it, but obviously I've already talked about how to work at Redwood. This is unique to Redwood, so we have a single file called routes.js or routes.ts if you're using TypeScript. And this file lists out all the different URLs that you could possibly have within your application. Obviously, like I said, this is a huge differentiator. So why has this become my favorite? Well, with the file and folder-based routing systems, your organization for your project becomes tied to the routes. If a route needs to change, then you have to move those files and folders around, which has the potential to break path imports. Or with a flat router, you're including layout details within your file and folder name. So you're smushing those two pieces of information that are both different together to form your file name. With Redwood's router.js file, there's a single file with all the information that you need. And the syntax looks very similar to JSX, which is something that you're probably already comfortable with coming from React. So let's take a look at this first route component in this file. So the path attribute specifies that particular URL that you want the page to use. Then the page attribute specifies the page component that the user should see when they go to that particular URL. Then the name attribute is how you identify this route. And in my opinion, this is one of the best features of this particular system, because as long as you reference the routes throughout the application with these names, then you can change the paths all day long and none of your links will ever break. So a prime example of this would be, say, the login page. Right now it's set to go to /login, but if you wanted to change that to, say, /sign-in, you can make that change in a single place here. All you have to do within your routes file is just change that URL. And again, your links continue to work. So with Redwood, when you want to handle layouts, you can do that here within a set. So here are all my auth pages. We have a login, we have sign up, password, reset password, and accept and invite. These elements are all wrapped within a set component, and that has a wrap attribute that you'll notice, and it is calling the auth layout component. And again, you aren't forced into a specific URL convention or a file naming convention based on the layout. You're just able to use JSX to say, I'm going to wrap all of these with a layout. Now let's look at another type of set components. Here I have a private set. And these are password protected pages. That's right, with Redwood you get authentication right out of the box. So I can just say by wrapping it that anything inside my private set is password protected. We have an unauthenticated attribute there that sends people to the login route if the user is not logged in. That name login, remember, refers to the name parameter, or excuse me, the name attribute. And then a few weeks ago, we also released a blog post on our website talking about how we're moving a lot of the auth stuff to middleware if you're interested in that. We'll talk about middleware in just a minute. So scalability. When you're exploring all these different methodologies, one thing to consider is how well it's scaled. It's easy sometimes when you have a demo project There's just a few pages. But then this is a large, very large side project that I tried to build within Remix. There are so many pages. So trying to find what I needed became difficult. And because, like if you're using VS Code, you're constantly having to resize that sidebar pane when you're looking for a file to find what you need. So that became difficult. And then sometimes trying to come back to a project, and then when you're reading the layout, it's like, no, I don't need to know the layout, I need to know the file. You're having to process both of those sets of information at the same time. So anyways, just things to consider that you might not normally consider if it's just a demo project. Now, since this is a Remix example, I will say in their defense that they are getting ready to rework how their router works and lean more into a config-based routing system where it's a file that describes those things. So I think that they know this is a pain point. Now, let's take a look at CRUD. So first, let's look at the reading of data, that R piece. Within Remix, they have something called a data loader pattern. On every page, you have a function that you export called loader, and this runs on the server. And then within the page component, so this is actually within the same file where I have my component, I have that use loader data hook at the top. And that allows me to get that data that's from that loader function. So if you come back, it's, I think, oh, it doesn't say that there. When you have your loader, you are returning your data from that function, and then that use loader data hook allows you to retrieve it. So, and then I can loop over it and display that content. So with Remix, I do like how it's very clear this loader function is happening on the server. I know this is where I go to grab all my content that I'm using. So it is nice having that separation of concerns. With Astro, this is kind of interesting. They use something called fences. So that's 3 dashes, and it looks kind of like front matter if you've ever used a markdown before. So everything that happens within those fences happens on the server. So if you're using Supabase, you can have the Supabase fetch call within the fences and then access that content within the component. Next is a little bit more complicated because there's so many options and 2 different APIs to choose from. There's the Pages API and the App API. It allows you to use React Server components. So this particular example is from the App API. And here you can make, excuse me, you can make the database call directly within the component, but it is running on the server. Within the next Pages API, they have this get static props. And here we're able to statically generate the site. And typically you'll see get static props coupled with get static paths. So I know there's like little nuances within their naming convention. This is used when you're trying to figure out all the paths for a page. So you get static paths determines all the URLs and all the content, and then the get static props will use those paths to figure out what information you need for those particular pages. Get server-side props, so that's kind of difficult because like I said, there's small nuances in the naming. This allows you to run a query on the server, but it runs when the user makes the request. So before is like on build time. You can generate all those pages that your site needs if you're using that method. Here we're saying when a user goes to that page, wants to grab it, this particular function will then run that code when the user asks for it. It also supports get client-side fetching. So notice this is inside a use effect, and the square brackets mean that will only happen once. That's at the bottom on line 14 when that component mounts. So that means that it's going to run within the browser. With Svelte, they have a concept called a store. So you can kind of think of that as React context. So if you kind of zoom in here, you can make data requests directly within the page or the layouts files, and Svelte components are fast enough to know whether they should run on the server or the client and when they need that data. But you can also configure the file name to only access that on the server by using .server.ts, and it will force the code to run on the server instead of the client. So that's helpful if you're using like an API key that you don't want to be revealed to the end user. So let's look at Redwood and how you can access content with Redwood. So within Redwood, we have a concept called generators. We can generate pages, layouts, and API functions. But here, we're creating a cell. And cells are a unique feature to Redwood. So if we run this particular line within the command line in the terminal, you'll get this file. Now, when you're working with data, there's several different pieces of data that you need to account for. So here we have the query. So this is what you need to fetch the data or query the database. As I mentioned with Redwood, we're using GraphQL out of the box. So this is a GraphQL query. You also have a loading state, so what actually gets displayed when the component is loading the data from the database. You have an empty component, so what happens when the database returns no data. You'll also have a failed state, so what gets displayed when there's an error. And then you also have a success state, so when everything goes according to plan, what gets displayed. And you'll notice that within Redwood, these are all different components. Redwood is smart enough to deliver the appropriate component at the right time, depending on the result that it gets back from the database. Now, let's look at how a cell changes with React Server components. So with the next iteration of Redwood, we are going all in on React Server components. So if you want to experiment with this particular code, you will have to use a different version than what's available. You just have to turn on a few flags. But let's look at how this is going to change. So this particular cell is a server cell. And if you're not a fan of GraphQL, we'll continue to support that. But if you're not a fan of GraphQL, this is good news for you because you don't have to use it. But you'll notice that this first component here, it's called data. It's not called query. That's because I'm no longer using GraphQL, and this is a direct Prisma call to the database. And Prisma also ships directly with Redwood. Then we also have a loading state, an empty state, a failed state, and a success state. And then here in that success state, it's just displaying the products that we get in return from the server. Pretty cool. So let's go back to our CRUD, and this time let's focus on that create, update, and delete. And really, that's just forms, right? That's what you use a form for, is to manipulate all those things. So within the Next.js app API, there's a thing called form actions. So you can call a function that will run on the server. So this is a server function called create invoice, and we can run that, like I said, on the server. It has use server denoted at the top. Within Remix, they have their own form component. You'll notice that's a capital F there. And I'm passing in the method for post. If you don't specify an action, it will automatically run on that same URL that it's being called on. And each page component has an action function. So we already talked about how it already has a loader function. It also has an action function. And the top, where we're fetching, at the top we are fetching the data from the form, and then we're actually doing something with that data. There are a few nuances here. So with Remix, you can also use what's called a form fetcher. So that use fetch hook allows you, prevents the entire page from refreshing if you want to do something quick and snappy. That way you don't have to force an entire page reload. So this is only going to refresh the parts that actually get updated. And this, like I said, this is great for reactivity. And Remix also has some patterns for handling data optimistically. So it seems like it's really fast when you're using it. But you do have to wrap everything within a form tag. So sometimes this can make your code look a little cluttered because every single thing is wrapped in a form. With Astro, you can use a standard form tag. So here I created an API route to handle the form submission. So if we looked on the folder structure, inside my pages folder, there's an API folder. And inside I have all the content that I want to run on the server to help handle, say, form actions or things like that. So you'll notice there is a new.ts file, and inside I have a function called post. Since this is a post request, it will handle that particular form submission. Now, when I've worked with Next.js Pages API, I will typically reach for React Hook Form. This is a great library that handles all the pieces of state that come with working with forms. And coincidentally, Redwood also uses this out of the box. So in Redwood, when a form is submitted, it will trigger this onSubmit form tag, and we're telling it to call the handle submit function here. So if we look at this particular function, we're calling add link, where we pass it all of the content that we got from our form. So where did that add link function come from? And I'll admit, this is probably the most confusing part of Redwood, but like I said, it is changing since we're going all in on React Server components. So at the very top of our file, there's a GraphQL mutation. And this is GraphQL call that handles all of the creating of the link on the server. And then we're using Apollo to set up the mutation. Apollo is a great library for working with GraphQL. And in my opinion, it's probably the easiest way to work with GraphQL, but it does take a little bit of boilerplate code. So within Apollo, we can use React hooks to use query or use mutation. Since we looked at the Redwood code, we really don't use mutation because that gets wrapped up in the cell behind the scenes, but we do use the use mutation. When you call it, you're passing it the name of the GraphQL mutation that we defined at the top. And then the second parameter includes a bunch of options. So here I'm telling it to do what I want it to do once it's completed, and then if there's an error. When you call use mutation, it will return an array. And the first item is the name of the function. So here I'm calling it that add link. That's what we use within that handle submit. And then the second item in the array is a status option. So that status option includes stuff for error handling and the loading state. Now, to summarize with the GraphQL mutations, you have three places. You have that mutation at the top that we looked at. Then you have the use mutation from Apollo where we get the function add link. And then you actually have the handle form submit. So like I said, that's probably the most complicated part of Redwood is the fact that you feel like you're defining that 3 times, which doesn't necessarily feel great, but then again, all of that's changing. So another piece that you have to look at when you're talking about frameworks is rendering. So rendering comes down to when and where. That sounds terrible. So with when, you're talking about build time versus request time. And as we're going through these with render modes, there's so much alphabet soup. And I'll be honest, I have trouble keeping straight all the acronyms. So we'll try and break it down a little bit. But with when, you have build time and request time. With where, you have whether that's happening on the client or the server side. So let's look at some of these acronyms. So you have CSR, which is client-side rendering. So it's happening on the client, which is the browser, at the time of request. So we already looked at an example of that with the use fetch. With SSR, that stands for server-side rendering. So that's on the server at the time the request is actually made. You have SSG, which is static site generation. So that happens on the server at build time. So that'll generate your pages for you because it's that static piece and it happens when you actually build the site. You have ISR, which stands for incremental static regeneration. So this is kind of a combination of all of them. Pages are generated on the server, but you don't have to redeploy your entire site if something changes. Pages are built when they're requested, but it's heavily cached. So if something changes, you'll have to regenerate that. But if it hasn't changed, then that page should be delivered pretty quickly because it's cached. So what do you need to consider here when you're trying to determine what render method to use? How do you know which one to pick? Well, a lot of it does have to come down to SEO, Google has gotten a lot better about being able to read JavaScript and handle that, but there are other systems that rely on that data that comes from that first initial load of information. Like if you're unfurling, that's when it's gonna look at that, say, OG meta tag information that may or may not be generated with JavaScript. You also have speed. So when the requests are being made, how fast do you need to deliver the results to your user? And a lot of that, yes, it can come down to caching and what your caching strategy is on your server. The other point I would say is updates. So how frequently are you making updates to your site? So I've maxed out build times on sites before because the provider wouldn't allow me to build the site if it takes, or say like it takes 15 minutes to build the site out. You have got to wait 15 minutes if there's an error. You've just got to wait it out, which isn't great. I've also run into situations with updates where, say it's a client project, you tell the client, oh yeah, once you make an update to the site, you've got to click this button so that it'll rebuild the site. And then you've got to wait 15 minutes. Doesn't seem like a big deal, or maybe it makes sense to us, but for an admin trying to manage the site, sometimes that's difficult and frustrating. So even though the information might not change frequently, and you say, oh, well, you don't need to update that page often, if they're trying to go through and fill out all the information on the site or get the site to the way that they want it to look, that update refresh button can feel like it takes a long time. So when you look at render methods, here's a list of all the frameworks and which render methods they support. Now, I also have a chart, if you prefer a chart versus this particular graph that kind of explains everything. And I'll be honest with ISR, I don't know if that's just like a Vercel thing that they kind of invented. I do know that they heavily cached up on their site, and sometimes their caching strategies are elusive to the rest of us. So now let's take a look at DX. So I mentioned that Twitter thread earlier, or X thread earlier. I'm going to highlight just a few of those messages. So this person said that a lot of it with the DX and how they're choosing frameworks, how will this improve my productivity against how much bloat it will add? DX also has to do with the least amount of size per hour or your ability to organize code in a logical concern. That's kind of what I was talking about with the file structure stuff with the router. And yes, it might be logical and it might work for you, which is great, but sometimes it might not necessarily make sense, but you've got to use it in order to use the layout that you want. So that's the DX. Now, let's, like I said, break this down. So with DX, you have folder structure, but then I also feel like you have a huge piece with middleware. So let's look at middleware. Let me add this in about folder structure. So when you're talking about the files and folders from a DX perspective, not just the routing, if you have the same name for all these different files, that can make a big difference within your tab bar. Like if you're looking at the tabs and they all say router.tsx, router.tsx, it'd be a little bit harder to find what you want. You can usually see in that little tiny script off to the side what folder it is, but it does take another extra second or two to figure out what file you're looking for. So with middleware, what would you use middleware for? Well, this is when you want to modify requests and responses or redirect users. Maybe you're doing stuff with authentication. You want to add headers. All that usually gets handled with middleware. And middleware is just kind of a fancy way of saying that this is going to be in the middle between the server and the client, so between the time a request is made. So these are all the frameworks and whether they support middleware functionality. So with Redwood, as I mentioned, we're moving to a middleware solution, so that's why it has a check and an X. Now with Remix and SvelteKit, even though they have an X, they have a different way of solving the same problem. So With SvelteKit, you can handle it through hooks or higher order functions. Remix also has nested routes. So you can put some of your logic within a layout instead of a page route, so that gets handled on a higher level if you have multiple pages using that layout. Now we talked briefly about longevity. Let's take a little bit deeper look at that. So how likely is that going to be around? And if I'm going to invest the time into learning this and to build stuff, is it going to be abandoned? So let's look at how long each of these projects has been around. So you can see Next.js was founded in 2016, Redwood 2020, Remix 2020, and SvelteKit 2016, and Astro 2019. So it's not just about how long they've been around, but also where's the funding coming from? How long are they going to last? Well, Astro, I did want to point them out specifically. Actually, let me come back to that. With Next, you have Next and Svelte, you have Vercel. With Redwood, as I mentioned, it's fully sponsored by Preston Warner Ventures. Remix is sponsored by Shopify. And then Astro is Netlify. And the reason I wanted to point out Netlify a little bit was because they are kind of like an open sponsorship almost. Last year, they were sponsored by Vercel, is their hosting platform. And the year before, it was Netlify. So it's been Netlify, Vercel, Netlify. I want to point that out because if you look at their sponsor page, they do change, and they have more than one. So you'll notice, for example, there's a sponsor for monitoring or a CMS partner. Now, I did find this website called the Open Collective where it lists out a few more sponsors. So I'm only saying this to say that Astro has a little bit more community-sponsored support than some of the other frameworks. So you can zoom in on that. And Vercel, with their work that they're doing with Next and Svelte, sometimes it can feel like, gotta catch me. Thanks for bearing with me. Thank you. We'll make it through. More cough drops. Okay, so with Remix, of course, the X factor is, with longevity, is they've said they're taking a nap. Who knows what that really means? They have a fantastic history of maintaining React Router. So they did show this graphic. And React Router does predate all the other current frameworks that we've looked at right now. So, and then plus they were part of React Team's original recommendation with Create React App. With the introduction of Remix, they were making a lot of the same commits to Remix as they were to React Router. So I believe the intention really is just to simplify the two and to do a better job of supplementing and complementing each other. So I really don't think it's going to go away, if you want my take. So why use a router? Well, it allows us to move faster. We can develop faster. It's more performant. Takes care of a lot of the hard parts for us. Framework developers are able to work all day and solve specific problems and allow you really to solve your different business problems. And they'll handle all the updates. So this is different than just like a starter kit, where a starter kit's not going to help you with maintenance. So for example, with Redwood, you can just run yarn Redwood upgrade. They'll handle all those upgrades for you. They'll also provide code mods if there's a bigger change, or we'll look at other things that we're using as dependencies and say, hey, this is what changed within the dependency we need to highlight. So otherwise, you have to do all that yourself. Now, most frameworks have a similar upgrade command, so this is not unique to Redwood. So this is really the question that we all want to know, right? Which framework should I use? Redwood, right? Just kidding. It really depends. That's what a good developer would say, right? So of course, that's my answer. SvelteKit, I do think in some ways it's easier. So it feels a little bit more like JavaScript. For state, you can just say let the name of the state and it equals this. And if you want to do a prop, you just say export and add that to the front. And like I said, if you want to update that state, you can just do that directly. And this is for people that are just, easier for people that are just learning JavaScript because you don't have to explain all the state and React stuff. Like useState returns an array, and this is what the first one means, and this is what the second thing means. But I will also caveat that they just released version 5, and there's a lot of changes to the syntax there. So some people have complained, since this does make things a little bit more complicated, but I've also seen people say, kind of the point that I made at the beginning, was that once you start building something, you like it. Personally, I like Astro if you are just trying to build a content-heavy site. And Astro is interesting because you can bring your own front end. You can use Svelte, you can use Vue, you can use React, or any of those with Astro. In fact, you can also use all three simultaneously. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do it. In the past, they focused primarily on content sites. So it even says that on their homepage of their site, the web framework for content-driven sites. So they've also said before that if you're not doing a content site, then you're not for us. But they've been releasing a lot of really great code, and there's no reason why you can't use this for a full-fledged application. When it comes to content and Astro, I love it because it supports Markdown right out of the box. So any MD or MDX file automatically becomes a route, and it will parse the content for you. So a good example of this is Starlight. This is a site template that the Astro team put together specifically for building a documentation site. Next.js, I will say they do have the majority. They have a lot of community support, and it makes plugging in other code. It's easy to find SDKs and Next.js specific documentation. So I'm going to pull back up that render slide and focus specifically on the options that Next.js gives you for rendering content. So this is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's great in that you have a lot of flexibility. You can make the choice, and you can control it on a per-page basis. But it's also bad because you have decision fatigue. You have to decide what you're going to use. As I mentioned before, you could have a situation where you've got to change it after the fact. Now, currently, Next.js is the only framework that offers React server components in production. So that is something to consider. They are married to the React team because they're paying for 2 full-time team members. And there is some vendor lock-in with Vercel. So you get definitely better performance if you're hosting your next site on Vercel because of their caching strategies. So again, these are not bad things by any stretch of the imagination. It's just something to consider when you're making that choice. With Remix, I really do like the data loader pattern. I like that it's very obvious that this is where we're going to load data, and this is the action that we're going to do with our data. Remix does a great job of really emphasizing the browser APIs and leaning into that. But they are taking a nap. So like I said, I'm sure it'll be around, and I'm sure they'll continue to create some awesome stuff. But we are in kind of a holding pattern right now. And then we have Redwood. So it comes with a ton of integrations out of the box. Composability, we talked a little bit about that in JavaScript versus, say, like Vercel. People love being able to compose and hot swap technology, but it also comes along with its own set of challenges. And people keep saying that they want their own Laravel for JavaScript. But when you look at the feature set on Laravel's page, Redwood actually offers most of that out of the box. We have background jobs, we have file system and storage, we have auth out of the box, we have a mailer, we have studio, we have testing, and we have validation. So if you're building an application, we have all of that baked in, which is really nice. So how do you pick? Well, I have these circular conversations in my head all the time. On a project, I'll think, oh, if I did this, I could do this or that. But then this other thing. So Other times I've just built the same thing on multiple platforms, which I wouldn't advise. But I think the key here is to experiment, and that's really what I want the takeaway to be. Build things, form your own opinions, and then go all in on one. Get really productive get as productive as you can be with one framework. Create your own packages and libraries on top of that framework to help you move fast as a developer. I've mentioned the podcast several times. Can't tell you how many startups that we've interviewed where the founder said, choose boring tech. And I know that's not necessarily the answer that you want to hear, but the key is to focus on the problem or what you're trying to build and solve those things rather than trying to solve for the framework itself. So what's next? No pun intended. If you're trying to figure out something to experiment with, I do have a project called the Advent of JavaScript where I'm doing a 24-day challenge in the month of December. The challenges are free, so it'll give you different prompts to allow you to kind of experiment with different things. I also have the Advent of CSS. You can register for one or both. Like I said, the challenges are free. And then, like I said, if you want the slides, I'm happy to send those your way. This will send you the form to enter your email address. And if you have questions, I am self-teach me on most platforms. But again, thanks for bearing with me through the cold, and appreciate you all.